So we keep pretty good records of baptisms up here in the church office. I'm pretty sure that if or your child was baptized here by, George Rogers or Hugh McGregor or Dennis Butcher or any of the ministers we've had here in the past 60 years, you can look it up in the church office. Don't do that tomorrow. We'll be kind of sluggish tomorrow. But yeah, we've got records that go all the way back to the founding of the church. Pretty good, pretty meticulous records. And that's true for almost any church from medieval times, really, up until today. If you go to, say, Germany, looking for your ancestors' baptismal records to do some ancestry type work, you can probably find them, unless the church was bombed in World War II or, caught on fire during the 30 Years' War. It's a fairly common thing. But the baptism of Jesus, well, there was no paper form that the Baptist assistant filled out in longhand, making sure that John had the cell phone number and address and email of the candidate before he or she waded out into the Jordan River. I mean, it is not clear. Like most stories in the Bible, it's not clear that you could get in a time machine with video recording equipment of the kind that Nick is using right now and capture the scene just as the Gospels describe it. And it doesn't really matter if it happened just the way Mark said it did, or with little details added by Matthew and Luke. I mean, as we talked about all through Advent, the Gospels, as well as the other genres of the Bible, are literary forms. They're not historical forms in the way that we think of history at all. They're not direct eyewitness accounts of what happened in that remote backwater of the Roman Empire. They're far deeper and far more important than mere history. Far deeper and far more important than that. They're meant to help the reader come to understand a new spiritual point of view, a new direction to travel in the reader's personal lives, but also in their community lives, in their national lives. The Gospels, not to mention the Law and the Prophets, and what we think of as the Old Testament, are more like revolutionary pamphlets to be read in dimly lit, furtive gatherings of oppressed people yearning to breathe free. I mean, we think of it as the Bible, but there was no Bible back then. So as Terry said last Sunday, these Bible stories address the world as it actually was, rather than a romanticized, idealized, or nostalgic notion of the world that we might see on Christmas cards or in Hollywood movies or in children's pageants, like we would rather have it, to be honest. So, what about the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptizer in the River Jordan? What is this story trying to tell its readers? Why is that story there? Why is it so important that all the Gospels have Jesus be baptized by John? Why is that a big deal? All four Gospels make a point of talking about how Jesus was baptized by John, although the Gospel of John, no relation, written years after the other three, treats the event as kind of an afterthought, out of order with the other Gospels, since none of his readers would have a memory of the oral tradition of the baptism happening first. John is a very, very different world than the other three Gospels. But then we have to ask the question, the world actually as it was back then, how was the world actually in Galilee and Judea 1990 years ago in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, the Tetrarch Herod Antipas, and the governor Pontius Pilate? What was the Middle East like back then? Well, it was just like it is now. It was a tangled ball of writhing snakes, just like it is today, but with fewer surface-to-air missiles and fewer uranium enrichment programs. No less dangerous, though. It was, just like today, a shoving, irresistibly brutal mass of an occupying foreign power meeting an immovable mass of people exhausted by war and atrocities and grief, people longing for a breath of freedom and dignity, just like the Middle East is today. I mean, that time period, so much like our own, has been described as two tectonic plates clashing and rubbing against each other, causing devastating earthquakes to erupt every few years. I mean, Rome had its poets and its propagandists, its biographers of the great generals and the great Caesar Augustus and his successor Tiberius, who were both known as Lord, Son of God, Bringer of Peace, Savior of the world. And those writings still exist today, and they're still studied by historians and classical literary types in those dusty back corridors of universities. If you've ever taken a classics class, it's in the older building that they don't often clean up. But who is speaking for the other side? Who is speaking for the other tectonic plate that was opposing Rome? All those proud people eking out a living on that little sliver of land on the eastern end of the Mediterranean. The Galileans, the Samaritans, the Judeans, whose own prophets had been speaking for centuries of a Prince of Peace, anointed of God, a Messiah to bring peace, justice, and freedom from the Persians, the Macedonians, the Babylonians, the Syrians, and most recently, the Romans. Who's speaking for them over and against Rome and their enormous, not only military power, but also propaganda power? Well, there were a number of candidates competing to be the voice of the Messianic kingdom back then. In the Advent Adult Ed classes, we went through a few of the competing voices and movements in the first century. If you were there, this is a sort of review. There was Mithras, a Persian fictional character like Superman or Batman, always depicted slitting the throat of a bull. And that really appealed to those of a more militaristic bent who were over against Rome. There was Apollonius of Tyana. Anybody hear of him? Big name back then. Who did miracles, healed the sick, cast out demons, raised the dead, and he was very popular for those who were looking for a more philosophical Messiah. He wrote books, wrote epistles, was published. His writings still exist. You can read them on the internet. And then there were several Samaritan messiahs. Samaria lying between Galilee and Judea in the south. There was Samaria in the middle. Jews and Samaritans didn't get along well, as the Gospels report quite a lot. There was Simon the magician, or Simon Magus, who gets a mention in the book of Acts. So famous was he. And then there's Dositheos, Simon's Samaritan guru, who is reputed to have known John the Baptist. All these guys know each other, apparently. And then there was John, at the center of a resistance movement in the early part of the first century. John was more than just a forerunner of Jesus, as we usually think of him, as if we think of him at all, other than this particular Sunday. No, John was a movement leader in his own right. He was tough, he was powerful, charismatic, and probably a little scary. in the way he talked, even to the poor people who came out to the desert to be baptized by them. You brood of vipers, he called them. I mean, the Romans no doubt worried about him as he gathered huge crowds, as did Herod Antipas, who John accused of being a cheat, a hypocrite, and an adulterer. We got him beheaded, of course. John was all about judgment, obedience, and strict adherence to and performance of the law. Maybe more like a football coach, than a loving Messiah. Judgment, obedience, strict adherence to the law. It doesn't matter who your ancestors are, screamed John out there in the desert. It's what you do and how you do it. John was not comfort food. He was all about eating your spinach, eating it raw and eating it cold. But the Gospels, all four of them, point away from John as Messiah, let alone Mithras or Apollonius or Simon the magician. All of the Gospels, John in a very different way than the other three, point away from John as being the Messiah. Here is what the Gospel of John says. Kind of an afterthought compared to the other three Gospels.
Now a discussion about purification arose between John's disciples and the Jewish authorities. They came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, the one who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you testified, here he is baptizing, and all are going to him." John answered, "No one can receive anything except what has been given from heaven. You yourselves heard me say, I am not the Messiah, but I have been sent ahead of him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. For this reason, my joy has been fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease."
Yeah. I'm not the Messiah. Jesus must increase, but I must decrease. Nothing cute or coy about that from the Gospel of John. They don't really fool around with it. They figure John figured his readers had other things to think about, so hey, not John. What the Gospels seem to be saying is, hey, all of you who have been following John the Baptist, and I know there's a lot of you out there, we know he was a good man, powerful and popular prophet, but choose Jesus, not John. Choose love over judgment. Choose abundant life over wandering around half naked and half starving in the desert. Choose real life. Choose human life. Choose Jesus, not John. John's a good guy, but that's not where we're headed. And that's what the whole New Testament is about. Well, the whole Bible is all about this. Choosing life over death, choosing peace over war, choosing humility over arrogance. You can just hear the gospel writers say, don't follow the Roman emperor and his brutal Rome first policy. You know how that's going to end. And don't follow Mithras, a clever myth designed to keep you armed and arrogant and fearful. Don't follow the Samaritan magicians. Don't follow the Persian astrologers or those heady Greek philosophers, no matter how impressive they seem to be. No. Choose life. Choose love. Choose non-violence. Choose human dignity. Follow Jesus, even if you end up on a cross, like he did. It's worth it. That's what the Gospels are about. Choosing Jesus over these other messiahs. these other ways of life. Choose life in the kingdom of God, like a little child, as the choir just sang. Choose that over being armed, over being brutal, over being judgmental, over being too philosophical. Every story, every parable, every saying in the Gospels is there to get us to choose this new abundant life. So, the question here in 2020 is, who will we choose? Now, I don't mean us sitting here this morning, although we're included, but look what's happening in the world. I mean, Terry ran down the atrocities that are happening in the world, and there's been more since last week. Who will the entire human species choose? I mean, the emperor and Mithras and Apollonius and the astrologers are still pretty popular. In fact, they're gaining popularity. Who will we choose as a human race? Amen.